So you see a lot of takes on social media talking about video game OSTs and how they're, you know, cringe and not worth listening to and, you know, whatever. And I'm sure many of these examples I'm showing are just jokes and stuff, but like, I think a lot of people are unironically haters of video game OSTs. And at risk of, you know, sounding like a cringe Redditor, I want to come out in defense of video game OSTs. Because I think most of the negative things that people say about video game music are super unfounded, but not for the reasons you might think. And I can explain my defense in just one sentence. Video game music is not a genre, and talking about it like it is one just makes absolutely no sense. These pieces of music are all dramatically different from one another. They're written by different composers who have very different styles, who make music that is trying to evoke a bunch of different emotions in you. The only thing that these pieces of music have in common, the only thing that makes people bundle all of these pieces of music into one big group, is that they happen to show up in a video game. You know, if you're like a 60-year-old and someone says video game music, you might stereotypically think of the original Super Mario game or something. And that is a type of video game music. And some modern games do try and emulate that style. You know, you've got Shovel Knight. It's a great example of this, where all of the music is trying to harken back to the good old days of 5-channel NES music. But this is just one style of very many. If you don't like chiptune, you've also got metal music, or folk songs, or smooth jazz, or orchestral classical music, or prog, synth, metal, whatever the fuck this is. And these composers all write and play music for all the same reasons that any other musician in the world does. In fact, I'll just show you. Just as these games aren't that similar to each other, the pieces of music found inside also aren't that similar. Now there's an elephant in the room, because like a lot of the flame that video game OSTs get isn't actually about the music itself. It's about that, you know, that one type of guy that you're all thinking of in your head. You've all got an image of this person in your brain. It's that sweaty Redditor type of guy who very loudly and very proudly talks about how all other music is dog shit and he only listens to the finest of video game OSTs. And this type of person is, you know. These people come off as incredibly pretentious and incredibly elitist about their music taste. And these people are most of the reason why video game OSTs have a bad rap. But if we all stopped listening to music we like because of cringe elitist snobs, then diehard metalheads and jazz elitists would have completely killed anyone's ability to listen to their music for the rest of time. But we don't allow music snobs to get in the way of our enjoyment of music. Because that would be fucking stupid, wouldn't it? Now, there's nothing wrong with being the type of guy who only listens to video game music. But there is something wrong with being the guy who constantly goes around talking about it as if it somehow makes you superior to other people. In fact, something I see not talked about very often is how the rise of video game OSTs has also coincided with the rise of the indie game. As indie games have become more and more popular, and more of them have reached the top 100 best-selling games of all time list, the sound of the video game OST has just become more and more diverse. More and more people pushing the boat out, making weird, freaky music for their video games. Go back to the 80s and 90s, and the only type of music you found in a game was chiptune. And this wasn't a stylistic choice as much as it was a technological limitation. The NES only had 5 sound channels, and the music and the game sound effects had to fit inside of these 5 channels. Consoles in the 90s had a much more wide range of sounds they could make, but it was still pretty limited. Getting to the early 2000s, and audio become becomes much more freely available to the composer. And what you'll notice is a lot of the most famous OSTs from the 2000s are all relatively closely mimicking the score you would find on a movie. Like take the Halo games, for example. This is one of the most memorable soundtracks from any game from the 2000s, and it's all choirs and orchestra. Now, there were other games doing other things for their soundtracks, obviously, but all of the most memorable and highest budget soundtracks from the time were all trying to be the movies. And you can still hear that in AAA games of today. Like take the God of War soundtrack. It's not quite John Williams, but you could imagine this soundtrack featuring in a movie. But it doesn't take a genius to notice that all of the most popular soundtracks of nowadays don't come from AAA games. They come from indie games. Toby Fox is the man around town at the moment. His soundtracks are insanely popular, and for good reason. His music is really, really good. It sounds great, and it's also really impressive from a musical standpoint. Lena Raine's Celeste soundtrack is also incredibly popular. The success of Celeste's soundtrack allowed her to go on to make music for Minecraft, the best-selling game of all time. And I couldn't have a video talking about video game music if I didn't mention my favorite OST of all time, which is the Risk of Rain 2 OST, and I'll try and pronounce his name right. Chris Christodoulou, I think. His OSTs are just insane, and you would have heard me use them a million times if you've watched my videos. These composers aren't just great because they made video game music in games I like. They're great because their music stands out, because their music sounds incredible. And I can't stress enough how bundling these artists together truly just makes no sense. The only thing that unifies these three composers is that their music is featured in video games. Now, back in the 80s and 90s, grouping video game music under one banner made a little bit more sense. The restrictive technology that I already mentioned did make a lot of the music sound kind of similar, but they didn't sound that similar. Like, even back then, grouping gaming music all into one big bundle still didn't feel right. You can still discern one style from another, even with all of this restriction imposed on top of the artists. And as time goes on, grouping these pieces of music together under the banner of video game OSTs just becomes more and more increasingly obviously stupid. Can you imagine, like, listening to the soundtrack of the Dune movies or something, and having someone go, "Oh, you listen to movie OSTs? That's weird, why don't you listen to real music?" No one would say that. No one in their right mind, because it would sound ridiculous. Because the fact that this music was written for a movie says nothing about how worthy it is for your attention. And just the same as video game music, calling it movie music doesn't actually tell you anything about the genre. And honestly, I think if you fast forward 50 years into the future, one day we will treat video game composers with the exact same level of respect as we treat movie composers of today. The reason we don't already do that is actually pretty simple. Video games are a relatively new art form. Video games have only existed for a few decades. There are people alive right now who were born before the first video game console, before the first arcade cabinet, before Tennis for Two ever ran on that oscilloscope. But movies are an art form that's been with us for hundreds of years, and they've had time for well-respected artists to spend their entire lives working in the medium, and it's had time for audiences to grow up surrounded by the culture that movies have created. One day in the future, video games will have soaked into the culture just as much as movies have. We're getting pretty close already, but we're not quite there yet, and when that day comes, this talk of video game OSTs will surely die with it. Because why would you bundle all of these incredibly diverse pieces of music under one unifying banner when they truly sound nothing alike? Thanks for watching.